Lost media can come in various different forms such as games, music, videos, and creators like Blame It on George and Nexpo show us that not only the medium in which they come in can differ, but where they originate from can vary as well. For example, there's lost media that derives from movies, cults, and even from the vast abyss that is outer space. Within the Great Void, the question as to whether or not extraterrestrial life exists out there has been around for thousands of years, if not more, and in pondering that question, efforts have been made attempting to satiate our relentless curiosity in this regard, with one example being Ohio State University's search for extraterrestrial intelligence, also known as SETI. In the year 1956, construction of an important tool that would be used for the SETI project began, and in 1961 said device was finally completed. The instrument in question was called the Big Ear Radio Telescope, designed by Dr. John Krause, and contrary to the type of telescope you would immediately visualize upon hearing that word, the Big Ear wasn't one you can see out of. Instead, it was capable of detecting radio waves coming from space via its flat tiltable reflector, which would bounce the signals on over to the paraboloidal reflector, which would then send them to the feed horns, and lastly to the electronics used in the analysis of the incoming data. The specific computer used to gather and look into the celestial radio waves was the IBM 1130, and just as a side note, a lot of the information I'm gathering for this section of the video is coming from a report written by Dr. Jerry Emmon, someone who, along with Bob Dixon, worked on writing a program meant to run on the IBM 1130 called N50CH, and the job of this software was to, quote, interact with the receiver to acquire digital intensity values from each of the 50 channels, which are laid out here and written vertically. Quote, 10 of these values were combined to generate one number for each channel, and the number for each channel was converted into a single number or letter then printed out. And I now want to break down what this aforementioned series of numbers and letters beneath the channel signify. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of 1s, 2s with some 3s and 4s sprinkled in, as well as a 6 that's circled. These numbers represent the intensity of the detected radio signals from space, with the blank spots in between indicating no measurable signal and 1 representing the weakest measurable signal. So naturally, the higher the number, the stronger the signal. And one thing I should note is that as numbers get into the double digits, they're then represented by letters with A being 10, B being 11, and so on and so forth. If we take a look underneath channel 2, specifically at that 6, the reason for it being circled is because it was notably strong, and taking a look at this printout in its entirety, higher intensity values at 4 and above were relatively sparse, so when this string of characters reading out as 6EQUJ5 was printed out, it was pretty anomalous, as this was a remarkably strong radio wave that lasted around 72 seconds, warranting not only for it to be circled, but an interjection expressing surprise was also written, and this was how the famous signal received the name, the wow signal. What made the wow signal so unique was the fact that it didn't behave like the millions of other insignificant signals scientists typically came across, behaving not too dissimilar to the extraterrestrial radio waves they would detect, and as a matter of fact, scientists were even able to deduce the general region in which the wow signal came from, that being the Sagittarius constellation. However, the exact source of causation, or even the precise location of the signal, to this day remains a mystery, and although there's been many theories as to where this radio wave could have come from, unfortunately they're unable to be 100% confirmed, as the wow signal, despite the many attempts to re-find it, remains lost.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded.
The footage you're seeing right now was recorded in the Atlantic Ocean, where an unfortunate incident took place. 7 specially trained and highly educated astronauts unfortunately got caught up in this mess, and their names were Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and lastly Sharon Krista McAuliffe. All of them had their respective stories as to how they managed to obtain a spot on this mission to space, as well as interesting hobbies and backgrounds. For example, Krista McAuliffe from Boston, Massachusetts was apparently the first teacher ever to fly in space, and Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina Carolina, absolutely loved jazz music and wound up being the first to ever play a saxophone in space. The mission they were on was a part of NASA's Space Shuttle program, initially launched in 1981, starting with mission STS-1 aboard the Columbia. However, the specific mission the 7 aforementioned astronauts were on was mission STS-51L aboard the Challenger Space Shuttle, with some of their mission objectives consisting of the deployment of Tracking Data Relay Satellite B, also known as TDRS-B, as well as some of the very first lessons part of the Teacher in Space project, a program NASA created with the goal of inspiring students and teachers to pursue math, astronomy, as well as space exploration. This was the program Krista McAuliffe was selected to participate in, and the lessons she had planned to teach from the Challenger while in orbit were to be utilized in education throughout the nation. And so, with all of this among many other mission objectives, the 7 astronauts began boarding the Challenger and eventually lifted off on January 28, 1986. Not too long after liftoff, the Challenger would end up in the Atlantic Ocean, completely dismantled as a result of certain elements within its structure being faulty, causing it to tragically explode under immense aerodynamic forces, and unfortunately the incident left no survivors. McAuliffe was never able to prepare her lessons as part of the Teacher in Space program. McNair wouldn't be able to play his saxophone in space for a second time, and none of the astronauts would be able to go home to their friends and families to tell them about their journeys in space. Immediately after the tragedy, search teams were sent looking for the Challenger, but most importantly the crew cabin, or the area in which the astronauts were in. However, it wasn't until March 7th of the same year of mission STS-51L's launch that the crew cabin was spotted, and given that the bodies of the crew had been underwater for a while, naturally they were badly damaged, and on top of this, due to the amount of force the crew cabin hit the seafloor with, an official cause of death to this day has never been determined. Eventually, however, their remains were recovered, and on May 20th, 1986, in Virginia's National Arlington Cemetery, the cremated remains of the crew were buried. The reason I went into the story of the Challenger Space Shuttle's last mission is because there's an interesting case of media that was lost for a period and later recovered, and I now want to talk more about this, but in order to do that, we must go back to where the Challenger ended up after it was dismantled, that being on the ocean seafloor, where magnetic tapes from the Space Shuttle's crew cabin were found. The data within these magnetic tapes that were degraded as a result of being submerged 90 feet underwater for around 6 weeks contained important information that could give investigators a better understanding of the Challenger disaster. However, in order to retrieve said data, the reels would have to be unwound, which was proving difficult to do as the structural integrity of the tapes were corroded due to the elements of the surrounding seawater they were exposed to. And so, with this hurdle to consider, NASA decided to reach out to IBM for help, specifically their General Products Division in Tucson, Arizona, as they, in particular, had specialized knowledge regarding magnetic tape recovery, as well as the resources to efficiently retrieve the data within the reels. And so, through precise chemical cleansing on top of subsequent unwinding, IBM engineers managed to successfully recover the contents of the tapes, as well as having made copies. And although it's great that the Challenger's tapes didn't permanently end up in the lost media graveyard, the voice intercom recordings given to us through the recovery of the tapes leave us with an even more unnerving picture of the disaster, as they indicate the crew of mission STS-51L wasn't aware that anything was wrong with the space shuttle until it was too late, and transcripts of the recording show us that the very last words uttered by Michael Smith were simply, "Uh-oh."